Something gigantic just happened in Hungary. A Budapest blow that Putin never saw coming has just crippled the Russian war machine. In just 24 hours, the entire situation in Europe transformed. Barriers have been lifted. Putin has lost the most powerful ally that he had on the continent. And now Putin's war is over. Ukraine is going to power up in ways that it never has before. And it's all for one simple reason: Viktor Orbán is gone. Hungary has a new prime minister. Péter Magyar and his Tisza party struck a historic blow against Putin when it won 53% of the vote to put an end to 16 years of rule by former Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. That victory has resulted in Tisza having a supermajority in Hungary's National Assembly, as it's taken 141 seats of the 199 available. In other words, there is nothing that Orbán's weakened party can do to stop Magyar and Tisza from leading Hungary as they intend to lead. Magyar is wasting no time in dismantling the oppressive and authoritarian systems that Orbán created. Soon after the victory, Magyar won a pledge from Hungarian President Tamás Sulyok to bring forward the formation of the country's new parliament to May 4th. Orbán has less than 2 weeks left in power, and he has become a lame duck waiting to be put out of his misery. The public TV and radio stations that for so long ignored Magyar at Orbán's request are now filled with the new Prime Minister's proclamations about how he is going to appoint impartial editors at the very news programs that Orbán set up to deify himself. Other plans are being put into motion to ensure nobody like Orbán can ever rule again. Magyar says he will work on setting a 2-term limit for any future Hungarian leader, which will stop Orbán from running again. Magyar has also taken aim at the Fidesz party that for so long has held Hungary under an iron grip. My message to Fidesz leaders and their stooges: it's no use playing the innocent little ballet girl now and acting as if nothing happened, Magyar declared, adding, "We know what you've done to our beloved homeland and the Hungarian people, and don't doubt for a single moment that you will reap what you sow." An authoritarian legacy is being dismantled before our eyes. Sulyok, whom Magyar told to his face is morally unfit to act in Hungary's best interests, will soon be ousted. Hungary is also going to reclaim the state shares of the country's largest oil and pharmaceutical corporations, snatching them away from the so-called academic foundation that was really designed to propagate pro-Orbán propaganda. Magyar has even set out his stall as being a leader who is for the Hungarian people rather than above them. The EU Observer has reported that Magyar has refused to occupy Orbán's office in Buda Castle, where Orbán placed it back in 2018. Instead, Hungary's new leader will set up shop near the country's parliamentary buildings. As for Orbán, he has tried to remain diplomatic in the face of defeat, but really his tail is tucked firmly between his legs, as he is now refusing to take part in what would have been his final European Council meeting on April 24th. A democratic tide is sweeping through Hungary. And deep within one of his palaces in Russia, Vladimir Putin is seething. For Russia's president, Orbán's defeat isn't simply an annoyance within the European Union or EU to go along with all of the other problems that Europe has created for Putin as he attempts to complete his invasion of Ukraine. This is a catastrophe on multiple levels, which could add up to Russia losing its war with Ukraine, as a huge barrier has been shifted out of the way. In Ukraine itself, the loss of Orbán creates a problem for Putin that is so massive he may not be able to overcome it. But behind this problem, which we'll cover soon, is the most direct issue that Hungary's collective decision has caused for Putin. A vital ally has been lost. Perhaps the only real and influential ally that Putin had in the EU. Ever since Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine, he's been able to rely on Hungary under Orbán to run interference on every decision that the EU makes that could benefit Ukraine. To Putin, Orbán was a symbolic example of the influence that Russia can wield far beyond its own borders. Hungary itself was never going to be much of an ally, militaristically speaking, to Putin. It's a small country that has a population less than the number of people living in Moscow. Hungary's military has just 41,600 personnel, which is a number so low that it's dangerously close to the 35,000-plus soldiers that Russia lost in Ukraine in March alone. As a military force, Hungary had no real value to Putin. The inept strategy of Russia's leader would have burned through any soldiers that Hungary sent in days. But it was never about military might for Putin. Hungary was massive because Orbán represented the loudest voice within the EU that would consistently side with Russia's leader. Putin has used Orbán as a puppet for almost as long as Hungary's outgoing prime minister was in power. Orbán was constantly deployed to slow down decisions through bureaucratic wrangling inside the EU. When that didn't work, Orbán would often leverage his veto powers. For Putin, Orban was a tool that he could use to win time and bargain with the real EU power brokers, all of which happened to the detriment of Ukraine. Once upon a time, Orban was a man who told Russians to get out of Hungary. He was the man that authorities chose to deliver a speech marking the re-internment of Imre Nagy, who was the post-war prime minister who was executed for leading Hungary's 1956 revolution against the Soviet Union. But somewhere between the collapse of the Soviet Union and Orban's rise to power, things changed. Once an enemy of Russian conquest, Orban became an ally. They say that power corrupts, and Orban's rise to the top of the Hungarian food chain was colored by his proclamations that he would return Hungary to the nationalistic values that once made it so great. It may have sounded good at the time, but Orban was modeling his leadership around what he believed Putin had achieved in Russia. From modeling himself after Putin, Orban transformed into the Russian leader's pawn. That was made abundantly clear when news broke in early April that Orban had not only offered his support to Putin but had done so in the most sniveling way possible. Orban reportedly likened his assistance to that of a mouse helping out a lion, drawing from a Hungarian fable in the process. That offer came in 2025 as Budapest was in the running to host a round of peace talks related to the Ukraine war, and it shows what Orban had become, a wretched leader who existed to serve Putin. And that's precisely where Putin wanted Orban to be. But now that Orban has been ousted, Putin is discovering that the mouse was even more important than he made himself appear. With Orban gone, Putin has lost one of the levers that he had been able to wield against the EU and even the very notion of a unified Europe for years. Energy is what Russia uses to maintain influence in Europe. Even as the EU has been slowly trying to extract itself from the oil stranglehold that Russia has held over the continent, Orban resisted. In September 2025, Orban instructed his foreign minister, Péter, to claim that Hungary could never stop pumping money into Putin's war chest through the purchase of oil because it had no other options. EU leaders had become fanatics, Shizato claimed. If we didn't know any better, this would sound like Putin talking through the mouse of an Orban lackey. Similarly, Orban was quick to tell the EU that he wasn't going to walk away from Russian gas in a 2024 proclamation. Hungary had signed a 15-year deal with Gazprom just 3 years before. Again, this was all music to Putin's ears. Now this particular lever has been damaged, not necessarily lost. We don't know how reliant Hungary will be on Russian energy under Magyar. But it seems that Hungary's new prime minister isn't going to be toadying up to Putin in the same nauseating way that his predecessor did. There is a second lever that Putin lost when Orban was ousted from Hungary's top leadership position. But before we explain what that is, this is a quick reminder that you are watching The Military Show. We make videos to explain how power moves and what impact those movements have. If you're getting insight from this video, make sure you subscribe to the channel to see more. The second lever is one that Putin relishes: fear. Orban preyed on fear to get into power. A once liberal leader became an authoritarian because he took advantages of conditions in Hungary that were ripe for the nationalistic message that Orban spread. When Orban ran for his second term as prime minister in 2010, 8 years after the end of a first term that had seen him push Hungary toward EU and NATO membership, he had a very different message for the people. Fear the flow of migrants in Europe, Orban blared. Fight back against the foreign interests that gain funding from overseas, and don't trust the intelligentsia. Orban followed a blueprint laid down by Putin and many authoritarians before that called for insulation in a growing world. Don't trust anybody outside of Hungary, fear them, fight back against them, and of course, Orban was the man to lead that fight, and once he clawed his way back into power, he made sure to amplify the message while he attempted to remove the democratic structures that could remove him. It all sounds very familiar. The Putin playbook was being followed to the letter. For Russia's leader, this message of fear was perfect for keeping the Hungarian people, particularly those who didn't support Orban, from interfering with Russia's machinations in Europe. Magyar's election victory has sent a signal to Putin that his fear politics aren't working anymore, as things are starting to shift. We'll get back to that point soon. First, Russia's response boils down to trying to pretend that what has happened in Hungary doesn't really matter. Though Putin's mouthpiece Dmitry Peskov has since claimed that Russia is looking forward to engaging in a pragmatic dialogue with Hungary's new prime minister, its response in the immediate aftermath of Magyar's victory was far more telling. Peskov declared that Hungary no longer enjoyed any special status with Russia and had now placed itself on a list of unfriendly countries that most of Europe is on. Orban was also thrown under the bus. "We were never friends with Orban," Peskov claimed in a statement that is a lie to the point of being absurd. What we are seeing here is panic from the Kremlin. Russia no longer likes Hungary, but it's willing to talk, and Orban was never a friend, and we'll say literally anything if we think there is a chance that we can keep Hungary on our side. It's a mess of a response that shows us that the Kremlin is very worried about the future now Magyar is in charge. and the Kremlin should be worried. Orban's downfall isn't just huge for Europe, it could potentially have a war-ending effect on Putin's campaign to topple Ukraine. This is how. You may remember earlier that we told you that Putin often deployed Orban to block decisions made by the EU that would benefit Ukraine. Just a few months before his election defeat, Orban had done just that in one of the most damaging ways possible. As Ukraine tangles with financial challenges, the EU has approved a loan of 90 billion euros, or about $105 billion, through a complicated mechanism that involves Russia's frozen assets. At least most of the EU approved that loan. The main dissenting voice was Orban. He is the reason why none of that money has made it to Ukraine, despite the loan having been approved months ago. Now the first chunk of the cash could arrive in Ukraine as soon as May, as Orban is no longer around to veto the loan. That's huge for Ukraine, as it means it can finally start spending big on some of the most important weapons that it needs to defend against Russia's aerial aggression. According to The Telegraph, Patriot interceptor missiles and Storm Shadow missiles are both high on Ukraine's agenda. The former allows Ukraine to defend itself against Russia's ballistic missile threat, while the latter gives Ukraine more firepower that it can use in the border regions, the occupied territories, and the Black Sea. EU ambassadors are meeting in Brussels as we create this video on April 22nd to discuss the next steps for the loan that Orban tried to block. Hungary's former prime minister had claimed that he would only sign off once Ukraine risked its collective neck to restore the flow of Russian oil through the damaged Druzhba pipeline. But Orban is gone now. That oil lever is one that Putin can't wield through his puppet anymore. On a wider scale, the Atlantic Council notes that Orban's defeat means that Hungary will likely no longer stand in the way of increasing integration between Ukraine and both the EU and NATO. The flow of aid money from the EU in particular will be made a lot smoother now that Orban isn't there to argue at every turn. The EU and NATO will also be able to make policy decisions related to Ukraine far faster, and EU nations will also be able to agree on sanctions packages without having to try to negotiate Orban's constant sucking up to Putin. Adding to this is that the sickening collusion that we've seen between Russia and Hungary will disappear. We already mentioned the lion and the mouse story, but the collusion runs even deeper than that. On April 8th, Reuters revealed that Shizato had offered to send Russia's foreign minister Sergei Lavrov copies of internal EU documents about Ukraine's accession into the EU. Other leaked recordings have revealed that Shizato has also coordinated with Russia to search for ways to ease sanctions being placed on Russian individuals. This is the sort of sneaky behind-the-scenes maneuvering that Putin has been using for years to undermine the EU's efforts to help Ukraine. Those who made these kinds of moves possible are now being removed from Hungary's government. For Ukraine, that translates to a lot of money flowing into the country, fewer delays caused by internal EU wrangling, and no longer having to worry about information finding its way into Putin's hands by way of Orban's cronies. In other words, Ukraine is going to be stronger. Russia, on the other hand, will be much weaker. There are some caveats to all of this. Though Hungary is no longer going to be an asset for Putin, that doesn't mean it's going to turn around and start pumping weapons and cash into Ukraine. Hungary is a small country. Though Magyar has publicly stated that we cannot tell any country to give up its territory, which is good for Ukraine as it comes under increasing pressure to cede territory to Russia as part of a peace agreement, he doesn't look likely to start providing aid from Hungary directly. He ruled out doing that before he became prime minister, and it doesn't seem like anything would change. Magyar also doesn't believe that Ukraine's accession to the EU should be fast-tracked, though he doesn't appear to oppose it. What we get from all of this is that Hungary isn't going to transform into a staunch ally of Ukraine, at least not overnight. It will also seek to maintain some ties with Russia, though nothing close to the extent of being an asset to Putin. Overall, this is a massive net positive for Ukraine, if only because of Hungary no longer being an obstacle to EU policy. But perhaps far bigger is the symbolic impact that Orban's defeat has. Putin has tried to spread a narrative both at home and inside Europe. The elites in Russia were happy to absorb the Kremlin propaganda that Europe was not united, to believe that the West was growing tired of supporting Ukraine, as shown by the opposition, which often amounted to Orban's complaints to EU policies. Orban was one of the people inside the EU on whom Russia's elite could hang their narrative hat. Now that he's gone, the entire story crumbles. Russia's campaign of influence in Europe is following suit. That's anathema to Putin, as his entire reign relies on his ability to control and coerce. Don't get us wrong, Russian campaigns of influence aren't going to be ending anytime soon. We saw what Russia tried to do with the misinformation that it spread in Hungary in the run-up to the most recent elections. False claims about Magyar using humanitarian trips to covertly deliver aid to Ukraine were spread. So were rumors of embezzlement and claims that Magyar would reinstitute a military draft. These are the types of misinformation tactics that serve as a cornerstone of Putin's hybrid war in Europe, and he isn't going to abandon them just because Orban is gone. Losing the patsy doesn't mean that the lie has to stop. But what it does mean is that the lie is much weaker. Magyar's victory in Hungary is ultimately an example that democracy can still win, even in the face of Russia's campaigns of influence. Even when somebody like Orban has worked so hard to control the media and spread messages of fear, there is always hope that the opposition can stand up and take control. Orban was once considered unstoppable, a prime minister who couldn't be ousted because the combination of his control in his own territory and his collusion with Putin was enough to stop Western democratic practices in their tracks. Magyar's victory shatters that narrative. Democratic correction in nations that Putin thought he controlled through puppets is possible, and that will damage Russia's leader even more than the money flowing into Ukraine or the fact that the EU can present a more united front against him. All will be factors in the end of the war, but Putin's biggest problem now is that Orban being ousted reveals that there is a massive chink in the armor of a mechanism that Russia has used successfully for years. Other nations subjected to Putin's campaign of influence will see what has just happened in Hungary, and those who oppose Russia will know if Hungary can do it, then so can they. As for Ukraine, it can look forward to a future where support from the EU is more stable and unified than ever before. Not that Ukraine wasn't getting plenty of help from its European allies. Sweden, which has emerged as one of the biggest thorns in Putin's side since Russia's leader invaded Ukraine, is stepping up. It gave Ukraine something terrifying, and Ukraine has already used it to great effect. Find out more in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show so you don't miss any of our coverage of the latest developments in Europe. And thank you for watching.